and welcome to Hope University. Now, this is where we always meet, and my front row people have gone all the way to the back. Hi, Ron and Carol. But we're glad that all of you are here, and hope you realize Hope University will continue on Wednesday mornings through the end of May. No more Tuesday. This is the end of our Tuesday nights until fall. So in fall, what? Oh, next Tuesday nights? Right, Tuesday morning. Pastor John has Tuesday morning on other religions. Dialogue with other religions. Okay. Next week, we will have a one-week session with Hope University on sanctification and redemption. So I entitled it, Who I Was and Who I Am. But I do want to thank all of you for being here, and let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Gracious and loving God, we thank you that we come together in your name. We come together as your community at this time and in this place. We pray that you watch over us and guide us in what we do so that our mission can reach out to others. Help us to know your presence through the Holy Spirit. Help us rejoice in the resurrection and guide us as we go forth in life. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Now I'm going to join the panel, turn it over to our lead pastor, Pastor John Mark, and he will hopefully guide us well the rest of the night. I did take notice that all the council people are here. I think if you were taking attendance, except the president.
All right. Hope I take it off mute. There we go. Well, we have some preset questions here to kind of warm up. And then I have a stack of people handing me. You can ask them from back there, too. When we get to that time, I will walk around so you can ask on the mic. So just wait for me to get to you instead of yelling it out, because other people won't hear you, and they definitely won't hear you. Although the answers might be funnier if they mishear you. That could be great. So I'm going to start out with a few. And I want to say up front, we're being joined by some lovely ladies tonight who happen to also be married to pastors. When we get to them, I'm going to say this up front. Mary Jo's not here. She has a stomach bug, but I will add this from her point of view, and I know at least one of you shares this as well. And I will share this as a pastor's kid, because I had a lot of questions when people heard they might be here, like, ooh, what kind of questions are we going to ask them? When you have a pastor's family in the church, they are not employees of the church. And one of the things I've constantly heard throughout the years, well, you can be, but it's not an automatic. It's not a given. Oh, thank you, yeah. So at my last church, the question for, and you guys will be thinking, I'm going to give you some formulated questions at a break for you to look at, so you can be prepared. Or you can just do your guts. There you go. A question was said about Mary Jo. She should not have a job outside of the house because she should be volunteering all of her time at the church. That was my last church. My last church said that. It's not one of the reasons why it's my last church. But they would make comments like that, and there is a misunderstanding with that. So we want to make sure that when we get to them, that we're asking them questions as individuals, not just as the spouses of clergy. And I'm saying that so they don't share our dirty laundry, to be honest with you. All right. Oh, more questions. Okay. So let's start out, and we're going to keep this is kind of short, kind of a short question, so you can get this one as quickly as possible. When did you go to seminary? How long have you been in ministry? What was your original denomination if you came into the ELCA, whether it's ALC, LCA, LCMS, whatever it was you were at Finish, whatever it was when you come into that? And then how long have you been at Hope? Just to kind of, so people get to know you. If they don't know you well, they get to know quickly who you are. And if you want to claim your spouse, you can raise hands too and do that.
I saw your thing was red.
Oh, no, it just says it's on. I got two daughters. I'm good. Should we hear? There you go.
The first class I had at the seminary was in technology, and I...
Well, as long as it goes you went, that makes sense.
Yeah, but that was 50 years ago.
We're down here at the old men's.
It's a
I started in the seminary, no, I graduated in the seminary in 1964, so okay, you all can add it up. I was at my 50th anniversary about 3 years ago, two or three, added up. And it was a unique one for me because I started at the seminary at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri, which was a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod Seminary. My father was a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod pastor. I had 4 older brothers that were Lutheran Church Missouri Synod pastors. Wow. Any rate, I know that's all true or factual. And obviously, where would I go after that? At any rate, about 10 years, a little less than 10 years in, the Missouri Synod was facing some severe conflictual problems, and they were really severe to the extent that there were a group of us that really felt that we need to be in opposition to what was happening. Because of that, a group was formed that was called Evangelical Lutherans in Mission. ELAM was the reference name. And after quite a few years, it seemed quite a few years, of being a part of that organization to do what we could, it was the whole thing with the seminary going into exile, and there's a lot of history there that we wouldn't want to necessarily uncover. And then the Elam group ended up forming into the AELC, the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches. And the reason they did is they said very clearly that they didn't want to start, we didn't want to start yet another Lutheran church body in this country. But there was a primary purpose for doing that, and that is that we felt that organizationally, rather than either American Lutheran Church or Lutheran Church in America take the initiative to say that we should form into one, it was easier for this new group to do that and make that overture to the other two. And that in turn happened, and that came to be the formation of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So it was in one sense a wonderful thing that was dreamed about for a long time, and at the same time it was also had a sadness to it because it could have been a combination of about 90% of Lutherans in this country, and it somehow just couldn't walk that far to get materialized. But we thank God for what we are now here, and you all are here with us.
How long have you been at Hope?
I have been at Hope since I think my last directory that I peaked at once is 2011. So I think I'm starting my 7th year here.
I think most of you know I'm Pastor Piper. How about that? I graduated from what is now Trinity Lutheran Seminary, Columbus, Ohio. I received both my master's and my doctorate there. And I was ordained, you were 64? You're an old man. I was ordained in 65. I retired in 2000.
Did you flunk a grade?
Oh, this is going to get me so good.
I do confess, Marcus, that I flunked religion my freshman year of college. That's a result of playing too much golf and not reading enough of the Bible. But I took retirement in 2003, moved here to the Villages. That lasted 3 months. Actually went on staff in January of 2004. So I've been on staff, 14 years, something like that. Most of you don't see me because you don't come Saturday night. But I'm the Saturday night hangout guy. Let's see, what else was part of that question? Oh, I was just going to pick up on what Pastor Mark said, that he was part of Elim, which became the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches. I was privileged at a ministry in Kalamazoo to be called ahead of time before the whole merger took place, and I served an AELC congregation for 6 months until the new church came into being, and so I was called extended ministry at that point. So that's the one insight I have from the AELC.
I saw somebody standing up in the back there. I'll stand up for a moment. Hi, I'm Keith Kopenhofer. Graduated from high school in '67 and then college, Capital University in Columbus in '71 and seminary in '75. I was the pastor for 39 years, 4 months, and 2 weeks, but who's counting? Retired December 31st of 14, and we moved to the villages middle of January in 15, and joined Hope in September of that year, and I've been on staff since November, about the middle of November of last year, of 16. So, happy to be here. And background was ALC. Congregations I served were all ALC congregations. I think that's good enough for now.
My background was in the Lutheran Free Church, which was a small Midwestern denomination. Then the ALC for a while, and then the LCA. I was ordained into the LCA. I followed a pretty circuitous path into the ministry. For a long time, I had thought about being a parish pastor, but I had a lot of resistance to the idea. So I decided that I was going to get a doctorate, a PhD in the history of Christian theology. So I went to a non-denominational seminary on the East Coast, and went through that whole track, and then got a teaching job at my alma mater. And like within the first 2 weeks I was teaching there, I got this call from the seminary, and they said, we would like you to come and teach at the seminary. I said, I thought you had to be ordained and want to be a pastor to teach at the seminary. And they said, well, not necessarily. You're one of the few people who's teaching in your field, and we would like you to come. So that job at my college was a short-term job anyway. So I went to Ohio to teach at the seminary. So after a couple of years, as that seminary was merging with the seminary that now was Trinity, and so I began to revisit this whole idea of, do I want to be a parish pastor? So I asked the person that was doing pastoral counseling on the faculty. I sat down and talked with him for a while and told him all the thinking and twists and turns of trying to decide whether I wanted to be in the parish at all that I had gone through. And he said, John, why don't you just try it? You don't have to stay in it, just try it. And so that's what I did. I tried it 39 years ago. So that's where I am today. And I guess the other thing I'd say about it, I admired the track these guys took, but the fact that I did not go to a Lutheran college, our seminary, I think, makes me a very committed Lutheran, because I had to think my way through the Lutheran tradition and make a decision whether I really wanted to be a Lutheran or not. So in retrospect, it was a good decision.
Yeah, I never thought about it. I got to get even with these Missouri guys. I was confirmed in Missouri Synod, though. My congregation left and then became ALC. So.
How long, John, have you been here?
Oh, I've been here 2 years longer than Marcus. However long that is. 2 years longer than Marcus.
Let's get a competition on seniority tonight. Well, I definitely don't have the chronological seniority up here. Because I will answer this question. Of course, my background, for those who might be shocked, and none of you should be, I wasn't Lutheran of any ilk. I was a United Methodist, and when I came to Hope in 2009, I just finished my 9th year. Actually, like next week. I think it's next week is my 9th. I'll be finishing my 9th year, starting my 10th. And here at Hope, and became a Lutheran in 2013. So I've never been anything but ELCA as far as being a Lutheran. I also am a pastor's son. but much more like John, I fought the idea of being a pastor. And we'll get into that maybe a little bit with the spouses, I'm not sure, but when you live especially a parsonage, when you live in a pastor's family, it's kind of like living in a fishbowl. Everyone knows everything you're doing all the time, especially in a small town. You cannot hide anywhere from anything. And so it can be, there's a lot of expectations foisted off on you. You see the wonderful good things in the church, and you see the bad things that can happen in church. And you see how they affect your folks, which then trickles down and affects you. And so I kind of thought the idea as well, I wanted to be a criminal psychologist. That's what I went to college for. So yes, I have profiled all of you at some point. No, but I really want to be a criminal psychologist. And then after I kind of grew out of that, I started taking philosophy courses and religion courses, and became a philosophy and religion double major, and wanted to be a professor. And then it wasn't kind of, hey, try it out. It was, I felt called into ministry, and I threw God a bone and went into youth ministry because that was fun and easy. It was fun and easy.
Yeah.
And the next thing I know, I was studying Greek in Wilmore, Kentucky. So, it happens. It happens like that. Let's talk about some specifics. We covered a lot of generalities last time we were together. So this was an interesting question about weddings. So we'll just quickly say, the question was, and we'll do both and. How many weddings do you think you've performed? And then we're also going to turn that around in a little bit and go to how many funerals you think you performed. But how many weddings have you performed? Did you have any strange requirements that you asked, that people thought were strange you asked them to do, or questions, or they were kind of common questions? And then my favorite part is, share a funny story or an odd story from a wedding you did. Remember that? Dean, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'll look. Be ordained 53 years this summer. My guess is, and it's a guess, that I've probably done 200 weddings. And it's, we'll do funerals later. But weddings are one of the trials of a pastor's life. Just to let you know, those of you who have had your children married, what happens is a couple goes out and they rent a reception hall for $1,000 and sign on. And then they go to the caterer and they get the caterer lined up for $3,000 worth of food and all that's going to happen. Next they have the limousines all lined up, tuxes, shirts. Then they come to the pastor. Hey, do you have June 3rd free? Exactly. And when you're all done with all that, they give you $25. But is there anything that really I discovered when I was actually I was in my second church in Michigan when Prepare Enrich came out as a wonderful tool to work with couples. It's kind of a very much, if you've ever done a Myers-Briggs psychological review, Prepare Enrich is somewhat like that. And prepare is to get them ready for their marriage and to find where they fall on likes and dislikes and all the other things. I'll just go on to tell you one story, my major story of a wedding. This had to be in the 80s that I was presiding at this wedding. They were not members, but it was a pretty full church, couple hundred people there, and they'd also rented they didn't have to rent, we let them use our parish hall for their reception. And they all came up and got there, and all of a sudden I looked at the groom, and I could see he was about to go. And he was turning white, and he said to me, "I'm fainting." I said to the best man, "Grab him." So the best man grabbed him. We fortunately did not have a modesty screen across the front. We had pews that came right to the front of the church. We sat him down in the pew. Tried to bring him back around. Had a little trouble with that. And a few people, kind of slapped his face a little bit. And they brought in water. And the poor bride is sitting there. She's not embarrassed. She's in love. And that actually showed. So ultimately, someone called EMS. and they were right around the corner from our church at the firehouse. And they came, and these two EMS came in with their luggage, their baggage. And what I did at that point was I dismissed the congregation to the fellowship hall. And I said, we'll see what we can do here. And it's the only marriage that I ever performed on my knees. I let him sit in the pew with his bride, and so what we had was a groom, a bride, a best man, a maid of honor, an EMS, and an EMS. and that's about 40-some years ago, so I'm really curious today if I could learn how everything went in the rest of their life.
Consistent with your love for weddings, we had a campus. Most of you know that I think that I've been in campus ministry most of my life, most of my professional life, and we had a John Carrier by name, but a person that wrote a book titled "I Hate Weddings," and this was after he became a pastor, and so it's interesting. I think I still hung on to it, and it's around somewhere. I don't have a specific figure at all. Neither do I consider it very important, to be truthful. But I do know that my file on weddings is about yay thick. It does make more sense that people in the college and graduating from college and whatever are on a track or potentially a track to get married. The other thing I know is that since I've come to Hope, the file is a little bit bigger for funerals, but it's not nearly as fat as it was in campus ministry, because obviously, thank God, that's not a very common kind of thing to happen. A couple of, I think, interesting things maybe that happened in terms of a wedding. We just went through the sound thing here, right? And you get better sound, and you have this time when you have a live mic, you know, or if you have the thing on and you didn't turn your switch off. And we had a new church at the only parish I was at right after graduation, and a neighboring pastor came in to do a wedding there. And so we went through the thing, but we said, make sure you realize this was a pretty new thing then. And they got to the point of exchanging the rings, and all of a sudden here was this bouncing whisper in the whole church, give it to her, give it to her. Well, and then the other interesting one was a Universalist church. Or Universal, is that the name of it? Anyway, back when, where you could send in $20 and get a title of a clergy person to, you know, do weddings and stuff like that. So this one guy came in once and he said, hey, can I ask you a question? Where is the wedding service found in the Bible? Well, that was the closest I got to turning down being a part of a wedding.
Melchizedek's 3:16.
Yeah, exactly.
That's. I'm guessing around 240, 250. I'm not a very good record keeper. I depend on my churches to do that, and so they had the records. I wasn't about to call them off for this, so I'm guessing about 6 a year or so, somewhere. And I love weddings. I'm one of the weird guys, I guess. Tell me about it. Well, I look at it this way. I got to know some really strange people. And it's really interesting when you're in this middle class kind of Lutheran church, and you have a guy coming in, it's all tattooed all over. You have to admire his tattoos and say, oh, I like your tattoos, really. And that was both of them. And I think the unusual, I had somebody that actually his family were members, but he hadn't darkened the doors of the church for a long time, and and he and his bride wanted me to have, they want special music request was the Beatles, Will You Still Love Me When I'm 64. I've never said no to any songs except that one. I said, you're promising more than that, you know? I like weddings because where else do you get a chance to preach the gospel to maybe 200 people who have never darkened the doors of a church before? This is my crack. I get to do it. And so we enjoyed that. I had another wedding I did outside little town above Michigan, and I'm standing facing the west, and the congregation's first looking toward the bride and groom toward the front, and all of a sudden I start picking up the pace a little bit more. You've never said the Lord's Prayer quite as fast as we said it that day, because I saw the storm coming with the lightning bolts flashing, and that was a quick wedding. And you didn't see this. Nobody else saw the storm coming, but I saw that rumbling in the distance. So we did that. And anybody else ever hear of jumping the broom? Okay. It was in my last year of ministry, actually. Not until my last year of ministry when I had this couple that came and said part of their heritage says they wanted to jump the broom. I said, okay. They instructed me, so it was kind of fun. Oh, jumping the broom. It comes out as an African tradition, and I'm not real sure of all the background, but they actually do literally lay a broom down behind the bride and groom, and as they turn around to greet the guests at the end of the ceremony, they jump across the broom. It's part of setting up a house together, I believe.
Consider it carrying her through the threshold. Kind of thing.
Okay.
Kind of, yeah.
More that carrying through the threshold. Okay. I'm done. Thank you.
I think I've done about the same number of weddings, somewhere in the 250 to 300 range. And yes, I'd rather do a funeral than a wedding. So I don't know what that says about me, but anyway. My strangest experience was my very first wedding in my very first parish. So you got to realize I'm a newbie. I'd never done a wedding before. It was my first experience as a pastor. And in all my ministry, I never faced a wedding like this one again. I think maybe God was doing it to prepare me, saying, if you get through this, you're going to get through everything else. Right, it's like a hazing ritual, right? Well, anyway, this young couple, they were all right. The guy and the couple came from kind of a strange background. But the wedding was to occur, the wedding wound up occurring during the blizzard of '78. I don't know if you were in Ohio then. So the weather announcement comes out that this blizzard is coming. And so I sat down with this couple and I said, you really should change your mind here, I think. I don't think we're going to get this thing done. I couldn't persuade him otherwise. So, what did I know? It was my first church, my first wedding. So I said, okay, you want to do this? We'll go ahead with it. So the evening of the wedding, they come in, and I asked them for the marriage license. They didn't have a marriage license. Because the courthouse got closed because of the blizzard. So what am I supposed to do as a pastor? So am I going to err on the side of grace and say, okay, I'm going to do this for you, but as soon as the office opens, you get that license and you come back and we'll get this thing signed? Well, that's what I decided to do. So the wedding, I don't know how many people didn't get there because their cars slid off the road and whatnot. And after everything was over, like 2 days later, I get this call from the courthouse, just reaming me out. How dare you perform a wedding without the marriage license? And so what could I say? I did what I thought was right, And as far as I know, the couple's still married, so what the heck? I don't know.
While he's picking that up, for the record, I like weddings too. Somebody came in, they'd come in and think they, during the 70s, but they'd, have from Hallmark, this wedding service. But after you started talking with them and whatever, and you'd get a very, it was always, to me, a very satisfying kind of conversation in the end, and it all turned out fine.
I would
That's always
add,
good.
I would add to that, I don't know how many weddings I've done, not as many as you all have done, because most of my churches became older over time. I did a lot early on. My strangest wedding, I've had some wonderful weddings. Some of the best memories I have of ministry are some amazing weddings I did, especially redemptive weddings, where, and I've done some of them here, a couple of them, same kind of thing here, where I've done a funeral for a man, and maybe a year or two later I've done a funeral for a woman, and then 4 or 5 years down the road I've done the wedding for the two spouses that were both widowed. Something very redemptive about that for me. My funny, weird stuff, and I have more than my fair share of those for weddings, mostly surround, the bad things all surround wedding coordinators.
Oh, yeah.
Not bridezillas, but wedding coordinators that were too big for their britches. I learned, my senior pastor told me, don't ever let one come into one of your weddings. And my first year, I said, well, I'll be nice, my very first wedding. I'll be nice because, I want to be welcoming and share the grace of Christ. That went out the window after my first wedding coordinator. I never had another one again. It was terrible. They want to tell everybody how to walk. They want to tell me how to walk and stand and all sorts of stuff. But the fun ones are, and somebody asked me this morning to make sure I shared this. I have two. I grew up in Fort Lauderdale. And I learned from the people in my congregation, many Jamaicans, for example, that there is something they refer to as island time. And island time is a very laid-back way of telling time. So when you say you're having a 3 p.m. wedding, your wedding will happen sometime between 3:30 and 5. And they all expect that. I mean, it's like no big deal if it's late. I didn't feel that way. I was freaking out that nobody was there, that people hadn't shown up. But I had one of those more recently where the mother of the groom had some surgery done, let us say, and decided that she wanted to make a grand entrance and outshine the bride in being prettier than the bride and showing off more than the bride. And so she was in a limo she had rented, and they drove around the block in Zellwood, Florida. Drove around the block, and I kept seeing this limo go by. And she was waiting to make sure that absolutely everyone was there so she could make her grand entrance and show off. Luckily, the son warned me that his mother had gone someplace to have her dress painted on, and that the painter had run out of paint at some point because it was a very skimpy, very tight, falling out of it dress. He said, I'm afraid if my mother sneezes, it'll be a completely different kind of show. And I remember that line. And so I said, you call her right now. I said, I'm not going to speak to her because you don't want me to. I said, you call her right now and you tell her that if she's not inside with a shawl on in 5 minutes, that she can enjoy the photos from your wedding because she will not be in it. And I've never heard squealing tires on a limo before. I'm trying to get in. That was a good one. My favorite one ever, also in Zellwood, because Zellwood, I had a couple come to me who've been attending the church off and on. They had family members. Both of them had family members in the church. But they were members of a church with a mega church with a huge young adults ministry that probably had 1,000 young adults in it down in Orlando. And they had approached me about whether or not I'd be willing to be part of their sermon because that's very important to both of their sets of folks. I said, sure, whatever you want, I'm happy to. And then they came to me probably 2 months before the wedding and said, would you mind actually doing the wedding? Because the other pastor is not returning our calls, like at all, from their church. I said, really? They said, yeah, it's the young adult pastor. He's just really kind of been difficult to find. And so I looked this pastor up online. And this does figure into the story. You need to hear this. So I look him up. Young, vibrant guy, African-American guy. Young, vibrant, great pastor. I hadn't seen him before, wanted to meet him. And the reason why that becomes important is they were reenactors. And they were Civil War reenactors who reenacted the South. That was their side that they always reenacted. And especially the groom was very into that history of his family. And they were doing a reenactment wedding in all Confederate uniforms and had asked this pastor if he would officiate at their wedding. and wanted a quote, wanted us to wear, quote, the garb of that time for who we were. Well, he was, I would assume, slightly offended by that. And so he just kind of never spoke to them again. For months, he wouldn't speak to them. So they asked me, and they told me all this in my office, and I looked him up to give him a call, and I saw his picture, and I said, this is a Confederate Army reenactment wedding? I said, yeah. I said, and you're not understanding why he might be a little offended? And I showed them the picture, and I said, think about it for a second. And the dawning look on her face when she realized what they had done, and was like, oh my God, I need to call him right now. And the groom's like, what? I don't get it. He just did. And even when he was told, he's like, oh, that's no big deal. He wouldn't be offended by that. Who'd be offended by that? And then we had that wedding, and I did it, and it was the strangest thing I've ever seen. It was just strange. And I realized then, I think for the first time, what my pastoral authority was. And to tell people there are some things I'm just not going to do. Like this is a sacred, holy moment. I'm willing to make it yours. I want it to be your wedding. I want you to feel comfortable and happy. But you can do what you want to do somewhere else. If you're going to do it in our church, there are some stipulations about honor and integrity and all those things as well that we will not be party to as a church. You would say you didn't sign the thing until later. I'm not going to sign off on a document that has my name on it that represents something that I don't agree with. So that was kind of it was a changing point for me. So let's talk about the ones that some of you think are easier or better in some ways. I think funerals for me were sometimes easier with people. They're always gut-wrenching for a lot of people. But people tend to be very, very happy that you're willing to be with them in those times. People come into a wedding sometimes very demanding and very sure of what they want, and you better do it my way or else. And in a funeral, they're just really thrilled to have grace. I think from my experience, and I have done, maybe 3 weddings, maybe a year, my whole ministry on average. Funerals, I know there was a year here I did, I think 31.
Right.
I did 31 in a year. So I have friends I've talked to, and I told them how many I've done in a year here, that many in a year, and they looked at me, they started when I did, and they said, Mark, we started with you in 99, and said, we haven't done that many funerals in our whole ministry. So yeah, my file's slightly different, so I've gone digital to save room. I have. Take it away, Dean. Talk about your funeral things. Same thing with funerals.
When I think back, I started a mission, and I've always served younger congregations, so I didn't have an overabundance of funerals, and I'm sure that in the 53 years, I have probably had less than 100 funerals. I served the mission for 2 years, only had two weddings and 1 funeral. The funeral was sad, simply, and they were, everything Pastor John said was great that you could walk beside the family. But he was a general manager of the asbestos mine in our little town in California, and he had mesothelioma, whatever it is. Mesothelioma. And so I walked with him in his last 3-4 months, all week by week, as he was hospitalized. And when you can make the funeral a celebration of that person's life, and at the same time celebrate their faith with the people who are out there and share the gospel, you're doing multiple things at the same time. And so that's why I've always said, I don't want to say it's easier to do a funeral for a member. Sometimes it's hard and personal and emotional, but the message is easier to convey if you have one. I do have one funny story from a funeral. I got called, I was in Michigan, I got called by a funeral director. He was relatively new in town. He'd bought another mortuary, and he said, I've got a veteran here from the VA home that he has no next of kin, but he wanted a service. It was in his will just to have a service, and there'll probably be a couple of nurses there from the VA home. So When I got there at the mortuary, there were about 12 people there. And he said, oh, by the way, see that family down there in front? That's his stepdaughter and her husband and children. Well, when it came time to go to the cemetery, and when you have a funeral that small, and I had a number of them, you help by being a pallbearer as well as being the officiant. And so we're going to the cemetery, and he's telling me how he would never, ever have a burial without at least doing a prayer. He says, that's why I believe you really ought to be here. And we kept going to the cemetery, and he pulled in, and he said, where's the car? You know, they always have a car that leads you back to where the plot is. And then he said, oh, damn, wrong cemetery. And he looks at me. He looks at me and says, what do you think I should do? I said, well, just go back and go around the veterans plot that was in the middle of the seminary and pull out cemetery, and then pull out and go to the other cemetery. And that's what we did. Nobody said a word.
I don't have any real funnies. One of the things that I would connect between, I guess, weddings and funerals is where the conversation started in a way, and that is the opportunity for ministry and personal contact and effectiveness of that because of the space, the situation that people are in. And whether it's a very joyous kind of time, whether it's a very painful kind of time, people are ready to hear a word, and especially a good word, at the right time in their life. And so and I think, as it relates to funerals, I think what is especially meaningful, I'll backtrack just a second. I had one funeral when I was on my internship. I interned in Southern California, and the pastor was away for something, and he said, you're on. So, and what happens is, you know, at that point in time, you know, I was just a wreck myself, and I was supposed to be helpful to the people that are there. The difference is if you walk with people, you know, in the latter part of the days of their life, and you have opportunity for the relationship that is developed during that time, and what that can mean then after their death, and you're able to be present and do some officiating and speaking a word in the context of that. Yes, I call it an intimate moment, and I appreciate it very much.
True. We thank God for those chances to be there for people when they have their greatest needs. Appreciate that. I guess I mentioned 250 funerals and about 250 weddings and probably 350 funerals. What's that say about me? People dying to get on my church, you think? Something like that. My stories of funeral, the saddest experience I ever had at a funeral was even before I was on internship, was a summer internship. I did the summer before I was actually at my real internship. And the pastor at an Oak Harbor had asked me to do a funeral. A funeral director had called me and said, they're not going to have a funeral, they just want a graveside. And we went to the graveside. I pulled up, and there was my car and the hearse. It was a funeral director and myself for a 93-year-old man who had died in the county home. And somehow that touched me more than any funeral I've ever done since then. But God was there, and we prayed and gave God thanks. A few months later, I was in my internship, and it was a nice spring day. I guess it was maybe about 8 months later, a spring day, beautiful day, even in Imlay City, Michigan. And my intern supervisor wanted me to get some experience with funerals, so this is a non-member, and it was at the funeral home, and the funeral home was just a block and a half down this nice tree-lined street, and I thought, well, I'm just going to walk from the church to the funeral home and for the wedding. And on the way there, some bird let me know what he thought of my sermon. Well, that, and then the funeral at one of my favorite church, and some favorite people that were a part of this very godly, faithful family. And I think it was an in-law that was not that active in the congregation, but there were some very active members of the congregation that were very close to us. And so we're at the committal service at the graveside, and I'm looking at this dear friend who's a family member as I'm doing the service, and I commit her body to the ground instead of the deceased. She didn't die to get there, though. The other one that really troubled me, I don't often say no, but I've learned to ask questions at funerals too before you allow certain things to be done. I've also learned that if I have family speaking, I try to be the one that speaks after they do, in case there's any cleaning up that has to be done. I don't like surprises either, so I'd rather have family approve whoever's speaking. Those are the things. A funeral, again, a non-member, but related to members at the funeral home. And just the song they had the funeral director play over the PA system just before I went out was, "I Did It My Way." I said, wait a minute, this is God's way. This is God's way. It's not my way, but your turn.
I think I could affirm many of the things that have already been said, that funerals are wonderful opportunities to walk alongside people and support them and to speak the gospel. I do not have many funny stories to talk about in regards to funerals. The one story I do have, it was the most difficult funeral I ever did. A little 5-year-old boy died, and it was on Easter Sunday. And my usher carried a note up to me in the front of the church just before I was going to preach. And on the note said, "Johnny died 45 minutes ago." So, great context. In some ways, I guess it depends on how you look at it, for preaching a sermon on Easter, but it was very difficult. Well, Johnny had, when he was born with a hole in his heart, and beautiful little kid. And they were aware all the time that he was going to have another surgery. But it wasn't yet time to have that surgery. So what happened on Easter morning was that he was collecting his Easter eggs, and that's the moment at which he died. This family was inconsolable. And I spent more than a year and tremendous amount of times trying to help them. The grandfather was a very difficult man to work with. And he wasn't a regular at church. And all he would say to me was, "You need to get the young woman, you need to get her to quit crying," his daughter-in-law. And I said, "That's exactly what she needs to do. She needs to cry, and she needs to talk." Well, he didn't want to hear anything about that. And at the funeral, no matter what I said, it didn't make any difference whatsoever. It wasn't adequate. I went out of my way to connect them up to counseling services. I visited the young lady, the mother, many times over the course of a couple of years. And almost every time she was crying almost every time. And the good thing is that eventually, when I went back there for an anniversary several years later, is that she had found peace, and they were still married. Which, if you know what happens, if you know what happens with couples like that, they often get a divorce. So I felt pretty good that maybe I had done something that eventually had been effective and saved their marriage. So
I don't have any funny stories either. I remember my very first year as an associate pastor. I very early on got to know some of the funeral directors in the area, and I'd made a deal that if at all possible, I would never say no. If they really needed me, I would try to never say no. And that word got spread around pretty quick. And this is in Tampa, but they were always looking for someone. I would get a call and say, we have a funeral tomorrow, and the other pastors come down with the flu or whatever and can't do it. Can you step in? And you're making phone calls to the family at night, hoping you get the names right and everything else. And those would always be done usually in the funeral home. But I remember the one, I got a call, and I'd done enough funerals, I was starting to feel somewhat like I knew what I was doing. I depend heavily on liturgy for funerals, especially when I get emotional. It's very helpful for me to have that to work with. The old words are the best words so often. And I got a call from a funeral director in North Tampa, off of, I think it's off of, for those who know, like off of Fletcher. And I'm living down in Palmacia, which is a good 45-minute drive in the traffic. And they said, we can't find any pastor to this service. It's coming up in about 4 days. We desperately need a pastor. And I said, well, I think I'm available. Let me check and see. And it was for Damon Chan, who was 22 months old and had choked to death on a golf tee. And I'll never forget that. And his name will be with me forever. And I said, I know I've told you I would never say no. I said, but I still feel pretty wet behind the ears for this one. If you can find anyone else to do it, I'll be happy to do pastoral counseling with something else, but please tell me if you can find anyone else closer to where they are or whatever, please do that. Okay, well, I'll call around. I'll call you back after I call some other people. 20 minutes later, he called me back. So I'm grateful for my dad, but I've never been so grateful for my father being a pastor and living in Plant City at that point, which was not even an hour away than I was in that moment. I called my dad and said, Dad, I've taken something on and I really need your help on this. I need some wisdom. He said, what's going on? I told him. He started crying. I'm going to cry. He started crying on the phone. And he said, son, I would pray and pray and pray that you would never face a day like this. So we talked about how do you do with a child, and I went into, I talked about, I was thinking about using King David and crying and the weeping when his child died. And so I did the service, and I remember the father sitting in a room just rocking back and forth. And he was some people thought maybe he'd done something to the child because he was not crying at all. But in the back, were just rocking, saying, just 4 more hours, just 4 more hours. He felt like if he could get the family through the funeral, that was his job, to get them through in one piece, and then he could fall apart. And he did. He had to go be put somewhere. But he was just rocking. The mom was so inconsolable, she threw herself on the casket. They had to pull her off the casket. It was really bad. And I remember the funeral director, one of them, her name was Alex. She had red spiky hair. And we stood together watching as they put the casket into the hearse, as before we got in our cars to go to the cemetery. And she looked at me sobbing, and she said, I'm so sorry that I'm falling apart like this. I know we're supposed to be the professionals. And I said, no one's a professional in a moment like this. And I was just broken. And Mary Jo and I had just started dating. She's a good woman. She's a keeper, and this is one reason why. And I was up, and on top of all that, my car had broken down, so I was driving the church van. And I went there, and I called her, and I said, I was about 20 minutes from her house. I said, can I take you to lunch? I just need some normalcy right now. And she knew where I'd been. She said, absolutely, come get me. I pulled up to her house, called her on my phone, saw I was outside, was walking up to her door, and my cell phone rang. And it was a Friday, and I answered the phone. Tuesdays were my day off. Friday was the senior pastor's day off. And a couple who was joining our church that weekend, or the next weekend, I can't remember now, called. His name was Steve. And Steve had just jumped off the Skyway Bridge and committed suicide. And my senior pastor said, it's my day off. Call Mark. And so I'm standing, Mary Jo answers the door. She comes back out of the door, and I'm standing there on the phone. I don't know what my face looked like, but I must have been in complete shock. And she's like, you need to sit down. And I said, well, no, I need to leave. I'm sorry, I can't go to lunch with you. And she said, why? And I told her, and she was all upset. I got in the van, drove back to the church, got there, literally took my vestments off and put them, hung them up in a closet, still had my collar and things on, put the notes away for that funeral, grabbed out a fresh notepad, had my book of worship with me, turned to go back out into the church van to get back on the road because they lived about 5 minutes away to go see the widow. And my dad was standing in the doorway. And he said, I just came to see how you're doing after that funeral. And he looked at my face and he said, what's going on? And I told him. And he was inconsolable. And he sat in that church van and prayed for me the entire time I was with that family. It was one of the best funeral things I've ever done. He was a biker and he was in AA for 30 years, suffered from a lot of things. And it was a biker-filled funeral, like the Vietnam biker groups. He was a Vietnam vet. The very interesting thing about all that was, I will never let them play my way. I don't ever let that. But they played Stairway to Heaven and they played some Alabama music. It was at the funeral home, not there. And I did all that, and I remember getting through that and thinking, if I can survive this weekend, please don't test me, Lord. If I can survive this weekend, I'm pretty sure I can handle the day-to-day ministry things. It made me so much more aware of people's feelings that weekend. I mean, I've always been open to them, counseling and things, but there was something about that weekend. It just, it made me realize how absolutely and utterly dependent I am on God showing up in moments like that. So I think that was, maybe that's harsher than people wanted to hear for that kind of question, but okay, let's go to some other stuff. Oh, ladies, do you want to start answering some questions? Yeah. What you have to give the mic, Dean. I'm sorry, but you have to actually let the people hear what they have to say. Here's a simple one. And you can answer this in whatever way you want to. What is it like to be married to a pastor? Duck and cover.
I'm almost speechless. When Dean announced in his class one morning, I think it was in the morning or the afternoon, that he was going to do this, and even asked the wives to be involved, I said, oh, goody, do we get to talk? And I said, oh, I can't wait to tell him that he leaves his underwear and his clothes next to the hamper instead of in the hamper. But he is really very good with his clothes. I would like to thank Hope Lutheran because they have allowed us as pastors' wives to be ourselves.
Amen.
More than any other congregation we've been a part of. I actually wanted to go to work and have a job to be outside of the home so that I did not have to be the pastor's partner. I did not have to teach Vacation Bible School if I didn't want to. I didn't have to do anything that I didn't want to because I had a job. I always had an excuse. But you at Hope, maybe it's because there's safety in numbers, have allowed us to be who we are, to be our own ministries in the areas we have our passions for, and you don't have any expectations of us. And that is absolutely wonderful. I appreciate it, and thank you all very, very much.
Amen.
I'm Pastor John's wife, Gracia, and I was PK, like Mark. I kind of knew what to expect. My mother was a pretty good role model, so I kind of knew what I was getting into. That's been alluded here. I guess as a pastor's wife, or at least me, I found that my main job was I was not hired, just like we've talked about, to be another pastor or to fulfill a certain role. But I felt my main role, which I think other women can share with their husbands, is to support their husbands. But after listening to those stories, you can understand why they need someone at home who is in their corner and, you know, that they can really rely on. So I always felt that my first priority was to do whatever I could to support him. And sure, he took his day off, and we would do something special together. And I did this, but not at, you know, but not at the expense of my own identity. I also learned that. If you've gotten to know any of us, why, that we're all very independent and have our own mind. So I may not always agree with my husband, and we made that clear, because we had our own lives. I did have a, as it was, in a full-time or part-time in a computer field. But it was always I just knew how hard it was, because I was in a pastor's family, for a pastor, you know, with all all that they deal with on a day-to-day basis. So, and again, I guess I was privileged that I would say all of our congregations were very good about allowing me to be who and I am kind of, like I said, strong-willed anyway, so I would have been what I wanted to be no matter what they said. I was, as a PK, a committed person. I was not one of the PKs that rebelled. So I was used to being involved in the church. So we always made it very clear at the time that he was interviewed, they were not hiring me. But I said, but because I believe all lay people, of which that's what I feel I am, should be committed and involved Christians, I was fairly active, but I chose what I was passionate about. So mostly I worked with youth because I had 2 young boys that I was raising, and I wanted them to have a really good youth program. So more than I needed to. In fact, I could talk for hours, and some of you know that. I'll stop at that. So did you want to say something, Joyce?
I got a call from Keith Kopenhofer, and I thought, how will I ever remember that last name? So I simply remembered the city of Copenhagen, and I said, that's how I'll kind of remember Kopenhofer. Now, I'm a year older than Keith, and so I married him when he was a senior in college. And I was out then teaching. So I taught 5 years before he became a minister. So I didn't marry a minister. And so, yes. And so we got married, like I say, when he was a senior. And he went for 4 years, and I taught school. But when I knew he was going to go into his senior year, I went to the seminary bookstore, and I got a little book. And it said, Minister's Wife, Person or Position? And I knew what it was I didn't know what it was going to say. So I read it, and it said, you better be your own person. And I know we all are our own persons. And so I'm very proud to be married to a man who happens to be a pastor.
Quick question on that, because you brought something up. How many of you were knew that you were marrying someone who was or was going to be a pastor? How many of you ever, so you didn't know? So 2 of you didn't and 3 of you knew. Wow.
Let me just say, you've heard John explain that it was a very circuitous kind of thing. We met, well, I won't go through where we met, but we started dating in college, and he was one of the few people that said they were going into seminary that I thought really seemed like he'd be a wonderful pastor. And some of the other fellows that I knew, I thought, they're going to be a pastor? No way. But he might agree, about the time we started getting serious, started having his questions about it. So I don't know what happened, but so there was a period of time where, I didn't know if he wasn't a pastor. He was a seminary professor, and that was fine with me too. But he eventually ended up in the parish, and I have to admit my first thoughts were correct, that he was going to make a very wonderful pastor. So anyway.
Well, I knew Marcus was a minister, but he was already out of seminary when I met him. and I was assigned from River Forest. I was a teaching intern. You have to. Okay. Anyway, so when I met him, I was there as a teacher, and the first day I met him, he'll probably start throwing things, but my roommate had a crush on him. And he came in to ask her to do Sunday school teachers meetings, and I thought, what a jerk. And then I thought, he was so sure of himself. And she had this crush on him, and I thought, she's out of her mind. Well, needless to say, a couple months later, he asked me out, and we went out, and we realized we really did like each other. But I made it very clear, we were in a parish when we got married, but then he went right to campus ministry. So I didn't have to be a parish pastor's wife. I could be kind of a mother on campus, cooking food for the kids on Sunday night or having them over to our house. So it was a whole different life than these folks had. And I always say, he's the saint, I'm the sinner.
I will add to that, Mary Jo, when she first met you, you've heard this before, when she first, you were telling some jokes and things, she came home with this big grin. I said, what? She said, have you ever talked to Nancy before? I said, no, not like in depth. She said, when I grow up, I want to be just like her. So there you go.
That's great.
I'm Carol, my husband's Pastor Bob, and he had a knee replacement 2 weeks ago, and he's doing well. He just is still on pain medication that makes him a little fuzzy in the head, so you wouldn't have wanted him up there. Oh. I married Bob after his first year at the seminary in St. Louis, and first parish was in northern Wisconsin. And that was the first time anybody called me a pastor's wife. And I just kind of accepted it. Came to realize that the people in the community kind of put their pastor and his wife as well in a different category from themselves. And I was very sensitive to that, and I could do a story, but I won't. And third parish was in Ohio. And I was invited by a neighbor to come to a little get-together at her house with other neighbors so that I could meet some people in our subdivision. When she introduced me as her friend and neighbor. And she looked at me and said, "You'll notice I didn't introduce you as my pastor's wife, because I wouldn't want anybody to call me Mrs. Medusa Cement," which was where her husband worked. So, because of that and my sensitivity to it, I had an opportunity recently to introduce Pastor John Mark to some friends who were visiting from New York on the night of one of the Seeds of Hope concerts, I believe it was, when Mary Jo was singing. And so I said to my friends, I'd like you to meet my pastor's wife's husband.
It was awesome. And to follow up with Mary Jo, she is quick to point out that she has tenure on me here, because she was at Hope for 4 or 5 years before I came, at least 4 years. So the beautiful thing, other than in other churches, you hear Mary Jo sing and all those things, and they would know that she was a singer, and they say, "Oh, goody!" Like they thought she came with me as a package deal. We had to use her for everything all the time. But when she came here and was singing here, the beautiful thing for me at Hope is she was already loved and known in her own right before I ever showed up. And I don't know that you can really ever recreate that. It really made things for her here super comfortable because she had relationship before I ever came on the scene. So she was known as Mary Jo. So I still occasionally, not as much as I used to, but my first several years here, they would get calls for Reverend Vitale all the time. Constantly get calls for Reverend Vitale, and I'd say, sure, that's me. I would take it. So let's turn to some other questions, what we have here. please discuss the rite of healing. It is not a sacrament. Why do we have it during communion? Well, I'm going to answer this one. Nobody has to answer this one. It's logistics, honestly. We don't have it with communion except for at the 6 o'clock and the 11:30, where we always have communion no matter what. We do it instead of communion for 8 and 9:45 because we can't get people, we can't make the service last that long and have people in and out of the parking lot, especially in season. We do it at the same time as communion because people typically don't want to walk through lines twice during worship. So we do it back to back, and nobody has to do it, but we offer it because we know it's very meaningful to people. We've been asked for it a lot, and we know it's a blessing to a lot. So we do it together. Just logistically, it works out that way. That's why that's an easy question. Okay. Do you have any ministry regrets that are shareable? It's like, wow. Okay, without saying what they are, do you have any ministry regrets that you are not willing to share? Just kidding. John, you have one?
I can't believe I'm the only one in this category.
Oh, I've got
because
some.
when you get into periods of time where ministry gets very difficult or in the midst of conflict, you're sometimes asking yourself, what did I get into, and maybe I should be doing something else, But I have to say, two of the most tremendous spiritual experience I've had in my life came as a result of having to cope with those thoughts at difficult times in my ministry. So it's like, yeah, nobody wants to go through that, but on the other hand, God was there, and it was a period of tremendous growth. So,
Yeah, you're right. You can't be in it, not if sometimes you wonder why. But it's not really been regrets about ministry for me. It's just regrets about some of the places I've been in that ministry.
I would just add, having been a pastor who went through a divorce, I resigned my congregation before the divorce was even final. But before we announced it to them, my wife and I had separated, and I went my way and she went her way. But it was traumatic in the sense that I resigned without a job and 2 kids in college. What do? I went into business for myself as a consultant in nonprofits, which I did with a university and an alcohol treatment company, and just a number of things where I would set up their board of directors and show them how the budget worked and all of that. It wasn't the thrill that I thought it would be, and 3 months later, the bishop asked me to do some staff work because the church was merging, 1986, 87, and in Michigan we had 3 Bible camps. And the traumatic part of it was to travel Michigan January, February, and March on those roads to all the many campuses, because we had 68 people we had to hire. And but there was joy at the end when I had one more position to fill. Now, if you could do this, you'd be great. I needed a person who would do arts and crafts part-time, would help cook, be an assistant cook, and also have a WSI, water safety instructor, certification so that they could back up the lifeguard. I was at Ferris State, and this lady came up to me. It was announced that we'd be there, and she came up, and she's probably 45 at the time. She said, what are you looking for? And I told her, and she said, yeah, I have a WSI. I don't mind cooking for big groups, and I love to do arts and crafts with kids. I'm recently divorced, and it'll really work out well for her. And it did. She was one of the greatest counselors we ever had.
Awesome. Anybody else? Okay. This is a kind of a short one. What is your favorite Bible verse, or at least one of them? I know it's hard to pick one. One of your favorite Bible verses and why? Maybe it's your confirmation verse you picked, or some ordination, or something like that.
I'll start out. He thought I was getting out a $5 bill. But from Psalm 132, I sometimes, when I can remember the whole thing, I might remember part of it. But when we go up and reverence the altar before the service begins, I always remember, this is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell. Psalm 132:14. So that's one's always meant a lot to me.
Well, there are always several of them that fall into place with that question, but one of the ones that I've always pointed to for myself has been Jesus' words when he talks about he was anointed to preach good news to the poor, liberty to those who are oppressed, proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. And that's always been a kind of a, vision holding kind of image for me, and a good word for me, and one that I hope I walk into all the time a little bit more.
When I was confirmed, the verses were assigned. The pastor picked them. When I was teaching, I always allowed my students to pick favorite verses, but mine was assigned, and I'm blessed. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And I found that so true throughout my life.
I think one of the truths is that when you become a Christian, you're actually entering into a battle of sorts. You're either on God's side or you're on Satan's side. You'd make a choice. And so I think it's 1 John 4. He who is in you is greater than he who is in the world.
Yeah, mine was given to me in a different way. My dad told me he had marked something in a Bible for me that he gave me, the Oxford annotated Bible that you get. We had to study for religion studies at Florida State. And he had used a $5 bill with a little note that said, get a milkshake on me, because we used to go have milkshakes together. And he marked 1 Timothy 4:12 and 13. Do not let anybody despise your youth, but set an example for the believers. It gives a whole list of things. And he gave it to me when I went to college, because I was a freshman, and he said, Mark, basically the attitude was, don't ever forget that just because you're one of the young people there, that you can't be an example to somebody else. And remember that. So that followed me to seminary. He did the same thing, same verse and another verse for seminary. It became my ordination verse. It became my installation verse and call verse here. I've kept it now, and I've always told myself, one of these days I'll outgrow that, because I won't be, people won't be looking at my youth anymore in the same way. Certainly the kids that I've done like multiple baptisms for their kids now that used to be in my confirmation classes already. Don't think of me as being young, but the rest of the verses past that part will always stick with me. And the idea of remembering that it's not just what you know and what you preach, it's what you live. And that's always the bigger struggle for me. It's much easier to speak to something than to do it. So I thought it was a good one. Describe your prayer time. Is it structured? Is it every day? Is it written? Do you journal? What's your prayer time like? And I might even say, let's add that. I'm gonna whoever wrote this, I'm gonna kind of change that question a little bit. Your prayer and your biblical reading time. How is that as a pastor for you to be doing that? What is that like?
My prayer time is, we pray before our meals, of course, but my personal prayer time is last thing at night. And it is structured. It's a way that I've taught my youth, my confirmation classes to preach, that you thank God first for what he has done and for Jesus Christ on the cross. Then you move to other people, move to problems of the world, and then think about yourself last. Well, by the time you get to the end, you're getting pretty sleepy, so you don't have to worry about yourself very much. But it's pretty well structured in that way. My Bible reading is constant because of teaching. And when you teach a class here, I'm feeling guilty right now that I haven't had the Bible open for 2 days because I have to do redemption and sanctification in 2 weeks. So it means a lot of study and a lot of looking at word studies, looking at the Greek words. And it's, but I would say, you know, my nose is in the Bible good 4 or 5 times a week for hours at a time, because I also preach quite often.
My prayer time. My prayer time. Is that what you said?
Both of you did
My-
the same exact thing, too, which I love. That's the best. It is. It's ice cream cone. Yeah. Go for it, Marcus. Sorry.
My prayer time would be in the unstructured category. I try to make sense out of Paul's words of pray without ceasing, and that suggests that one's whole life somehow be an attitude of prayer and be reflective of prayer and be reflective of a relationship with God. So that kind of has a core style and importance for me. It obviously includes structured prayer. You know, you can't get rid of that, neither should you. One of the things I appreciate within liturgy is obviously the structured prayer that is able to be real cautious and careful with the words and express things in a very meaningful kind of way and a helpful kind of way. And, you know, I think a lot of times when there are only extemporaneous prayers over against that style, you end up losing something as well, even though you benefit something well. So there are a lot of faces to it in that regard. In terms of my own spirituality and my own relationship to the Word, one of the reasons that I like to preach is it's similar to your teaching, but when I preach, I do a lot of background work and I do a lot of work that relates to use of Scripture, kind of way beyond, or there's a finger that I follow off this way, and there's another strain or thread that I follow off this way. And what it does is it feeds my own spirituality, and I value that a lot.
So you're the other guy that's begging for God's attention all the time. Yeah, I structured this also. The life is try to be in communication all the time and listening to what God's saying and focusing that in situations with the people with whom I minister or the people with whom I'm living every day. And so the structured prayer is a part of life too, and probably for the same reason Dean said, that it focuses us at certain times, and we do that. But like I say, I think it's good to walk always knowing that God is listening, not only to what we say, but to our actions, to our heart, and so I let that be a dialogue. Unfortunately, there's some things that God sees and hears that maybe He shouldn't be seeing and hearing, or I wish He didn't see and hear, perhaps. And but there's forgiveness. Scripture. I also appreciate the opportunity in preparation for sermon and looking at the text and the words that God is speaking seasonally. Usually I try to keep it in the season. As the church season has always been helpful for me. I appreciate the liturgical structure that the church here gives us, and the ups and the downs, and to focus our life and say, where's the gospel in this, for this life, for this situation, this people, and I guess then, and for me and those whom I love and care about. And every piece of Scripture, every time I've read it, says something different, because I'm not ever in the same place I'd ever been before. And to follow those directions, say, oh, I never saw that in that way before. And so we follow that in the seasons mostly.
I think I'd agree that good preaching is based on good praying. And a sermon that you really, that you ultimately feel good about is a sermon that you've really prayed through very much. The two things I do for devotional purposes, every morning I start out with thanks. Just a simple for all things. I can start, with that kind of gratitude. In the evening, that's kind of, times I'll use the Bible. Right now I'm using something called the Divine Hours, which is kind of based on the monastic morning, midday. But one thing that's, whether it's my Bible is this fading out completely? Is that I use Luther's trip method, which I find a wonderful way of producing a lot of for prayer. So Thanksgiving or in your life, regrets, what do you have to confess in your life? Intercession, what do you need to God to help you with? Praise, just praising God for who God is. And that's probably the most constant thing in my prayer life.
I would just want to add one thing, that all of you can pray, like me, living in the villages, driving a car. Lord, keep me patient.
All right, this one's almost dying too, which is our time. We only have 4 minutes left anyway. There's some really good questions here that I think get into some areas about angelology and things like that might be really interesting to do for a class if we haven't done one before. I think we could cover a lot of things with that, about the war in heaven between the forces of, the things like that might be all covered in a class, which would be a really great, at least one shot. Who was the apostle who went with Peter after they arrested Jesus? Any one person want to yell that out? What do you think the answer is to that? So we assume John. We don't really know. It did say disciple, not apostle.
Yeah, it doesn't say John Mark.
No, John Mark. Well, now John Mark, though, in the Gospel of John Mark is assumed to be the young person who is following after. They grab his robe and he runs away. It's like, great, Mom and Dad, you named me after a streaker in the Bible. Thanks for that. Yeah, I always wondered if it wasn't, we don't know, was it Simon the Zealot because he was a zealot and they had some zealot ties? Was it Judas and they just don't want to name him because Judas had gotten the money, so there was a tie in there and he was already feeling guilty and got Peter in? Who knows? Who knows what it was? We don't even know. And again, I think someday we'll be up there and we'll ask. There's a lot of questions I have that will probably not be important to me anymore when I get there. But let's see, where's the other one that was really... Who started confession? The rite of confession or the concept of confession. I mean, you had the whole idea of confessing your sins in the Old Testament. The idea of going and laying your sins bare before the priest, and they give you wasn't penance, they give you the sacrifices, things you had to do. Sorry? Confess your sins one to another. Then you have Peter who talks about confessing before you're baptized. Did everybody can make your confession? You also have. Oh, just went out. You also have. I'll get loud. If you want to put some batteries in, that'd be great. You also have. It was the Council of Trent. I think that decided to make it based on Peter's statement. I think it made it official. But we're talking late in the church history at that point. So I think it really comes from Old Testament conceptions that followed into early Christendom, where people felt personally accountable for who they were. It was community-based, but it was also personal, and how you lived your faith out and being accountable to one another in that way, and living in community. There's a very strong communal sense to confession in that you are a part of the community, and your health spiritually affects everyone. Takes part of it.
It was part of the catechetical tradition.
Yeah, well, sure. It came.
That in order to become a Christian, you went through a long period of catechesis in the early church, and confession was, a big part of that.
Early Lent.
Yeah.
Early Lent was catechesis time. So there's another question. Yeah, you want to?
There's,
That one's dead.
no, he
Look at you.
he recharged it.
It's a miracle.
I gave those old batteries to you.
Oh, cool.
The-
Hey, Pastor
the-
Moen, doesn't matter. I can be loud without it.
It's interesting in terms of scripture that, and it happens to come up this Sunday, so that's why I'm making reference to it. But when it talks about forgiving people their sins, and if you forgive them, they're forgiven. If you don't, it's retained, and and that becomes not sin in the sense of either people confessing and then forgiving in a traditional sense that we kind of think of it or understand it, but forgiving the sin is a person actually rejecting Jesus or not rejecting Jesus. And that's a different strain that John puts forward in terms of giving explanation to it. So I think that's another interesting part to think about when we think about it.
1 minute left. We'll hit this quick question. We'll just have like one or two people answer each one here. Your opinion on charismatic Christianity. Are they really being hit by the Holy Spirit? Some are.
That, I was going
In
to say
my
that's
experience, yes and no. You cannot use that. Let me ask you this question. I'm going to throw this back, and then I'll hear you. Let's throw this back the other way. Is everyone in a Lutheran church a Christian? I think when you say charismatic, the understanding people who feel the Holy Spirit. I've known people who I trust implicitly in my life, who speak in tongues in their tradition. And when I asked my friend to explain that, I said, that's not who I am, and I've never been who I really expect to be. I said, explain that to me. And he thought for a moment, and this is a guy, he has such just a gentle, honest way of speaking. He said, have you ever been in a place where you just knew what you wanted to say and you couldn't get the words out? You couldn't think of the words to say at all, but you knew exactly where your heart was and what you're trying to express. I said, oh yeah, all the time. And he said, imagine you have that moment and you open your mouth and it comes out. And you know with absolute crystal clarity it's exactly what you're trying to say, even though somebody else might not understand what you're saying. He said, but somebody else in the room will interpret what you're saying, and it's exactly what you know you're saying. He said that's what. So you have people like that. Then I have people I know who at their church handed out tapes on how to speak in tongues, here's the sounds to make and everything else. Now, so I think it's a real broad brush to use. I don't know.
Yeah, that is.
Time
else?
for one more. I think we have to do the angiology class and stuff later, because that's going to cover about half these questions
Okay.
that are left.
Bruce, did you write that down? Angelology? Okay.
Anybody else? Any last-minute stunners?
There was a miracle question that we never dealt with.
Oh, I didn't see that one.
Ever experienced a miracle?
Have you ever experienced a miracle besides a mic that starts working? Well, answer it. It's good.
I'm not gonna give a long answer on this because I wrote an article a number of years ago based on an experience I had, which I think is pretty close to what I call a miracle. So if anybody wants to read it, I got 10 copies here, and you can look at it.
So if you have questions about experiencing a miracle, he has an article he wrote. He has copies, 10 copies here. You can get a copy if you want to read that. I will say yes, I have at least twice, including a person who could not see, who suddenly could see again after having macular degeneration for a while, and asked the Lord and said, his name was Leroy, not Leroy, Leroy Brown. And he had prayed and he said, Lord, if you'll just let me see my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren one time, the ones he'd never seen, I will never ask you for anything again. And I walked into my office. I'd been walking with a cane for a while. I couldn't see anything. And I walked into my office, and he was sitting at a table that they use for council meetings in my office. And he said, Pastor, ask me what that gray book over there says. And I didn't even catch it. I was like, oh, what does that gray book say? And he told me. And I had a real Great Escape moment, if you know that movie, where the blind guy puts the pen down and measures it off so he can go get it. I thought, oh, maybe this was a setup. And I was like, is it April 1st? I wasn't sure. And I said, well, what does that red book say? And he told me, and I started weeping, and he was already weeping. I just started crying. And he told me about the prayer he'd had. And the kids came, and he was with them for a week, and about 3 or 4 weeks later, he went to the doctor, and the doctor said, I don't know what to tell you. Your eyes should not be working. Your eyes right now, I'm looking in your eyes should not be working right now. And about 4 weeks later, his vision started fading pretty steadily and quickly after he'd been through things. And people were like, aren't you mad at God for taking that away? He said, no, he gave me exactly what I asked for. And that has stuck with me. I mean, that was 15 years ago. It has stuck with me. It's I would love to see a lot more miracles. But, maybe they wouldn't be as miraculous if I saw them all the time. I don't know.
I just wanted to say that being a pastor's wife, that I pray for every preacher before they start their sermon. And my prayer is, God be with them as they deliver your message through the words that they have chosen. That opens my mind to listen. And I also think it helps them. They have spent a great deal of time in preparation, and that is one thing that we can do to get ourselves ready to hear the message.
We're at the point, hey, we got battery, just a little left. I want to thank this guy and let you all know that I'm sure all 4 of us up here agree he's the greatest guy to work with that ever has been around. Yes. He's not always organized, but we try to keep him straight.